It's great to be back. And by the way, I'm president, co-founder of 605. Our CEO happens to be in the audience, I think, Kristen Dolan, who is a big part of the basis for the company. So in order to give some context around attribution, I wanted to just provide a quick snapshot of 605 for those that aren't too familiar with it. The company started a couple of years ago, really based on the void in measurement. We were working on this at Cablevision, 5+ years ago, with addressable advertising and leveraging set-top box data to provide better measurement. But we recognized that the opportunity was really a national one. In order to really affect, the 70 some odd billion dollars worth of TV spend, we really had to have a national presence, which also meant we needed to have a collection of data that was national as well. So we formed the company two years ago, and our first data partnership was with Charter, which gets us access to north of 12 million households, upwards of 30 million devices. Just to put it in context, that's about 12% of the total US pay TV household base in the country. And what we do are really three things. One, audience analytics on the front end of campaigns, understanding what audiences clients are trying to target based on their own CRM data, based on third-party data, and more importantly, these days, a fusion of both their CRM data as well as TV exposure data. And then we also help in terms of campaign planning and activation. We do not sell advertising. We're a measurement pure play. We think it's really important for the industry to have kind of a neutral, independent measurement company. We're also not chasing the currency. We feel that the value of more granular data can be most realized and best realized through deeper analytics and in an area of optimizing campaigns, not necessarily changing the nature of which inventory is bought and sold, at least as of today. And then finally, on the back end, and what we really spend most of our time on these days is measurement and attribution, really understanding the business outcome that TV investments are making. So to give you some context as far as TV measurement more broadly in the States, the good news is there really has been a transition to more advanced comprehensive data sets, whether it's through set-top box data or ACR data through connected TVs. So the good news is that big void in television is starting to be filled. I think in TV's response to digital, to have an attribution response to digital, there is a heavy focus on bottom funnel. So for everyone, if you go back to your college course in marketing, there was this concept of a marketing funnel, whether you refer to it as a marketing funnel or a customer journey. The bottom line is there is a process that one goes through from awareness to consideration to purchase. And in the context of that, we felt it's very important to have a measurement system that can measure the progress of that customer journey and how TV and other media can be effective in moving clients through that. The challenge in implementing this is that historically, you'd basically have to measure brand lift and brand metrics through a survey and then separately pull ad exposure and sales data to understand to what extent brand lift metrics and brand lift is actually having an effect in store. In other words, you couldn't do it in an integrated fashion where at a household or target segment level, you could understand how brand favorability ratings are affecting sales. So what we've worked on, and we introduced this a few months ago, is something called the Impact Index, which is really just a full funnel measurement solution. And what's different is that it's measured on an integrated basis, meaning we field brand survey questions. We have a group that actually does survey design, implements brand surveys to get the brand metrics across the segments clients targeting. And then we match to that ad exposure data from the viewership data that we have, as well as sales data that either is derived from the client or third parties, so that we could understand at a household level and a segment level how brand lift metrics, are improving based on TV investments, but also what the correlation is at a segment level between brand lift and sales lift. And to make this more tangible, I wanted to walk you through a quick case study with Walmart. Walmart basically has two levels of television investment. The bulk of it is really driven towards shopper-based marketing, really driving consumers in store. It's offer-based, very traditional. They have a separate layer of TV advertising, what they refer to as reputational advertising, which is basically just brand marketing. And for the last 18 months, most of their brand marketing has really centered around employee enrichment programs or worker enrichment programs, whether it's increased wages, education and training, et cetera. So the brand group wanted to understand two things. One, what audiences and audience segments are most responsive and receptive to our brand message. And then separately, even though the brand campaign did not have sales metrics as part of their KPIs, they did want to understand what the halo effect was of their brand campaigns. Said differently, are the brand campaigns actually driving people in store, especially consumers that may have had a lower level of favorability towards the company? So what we did in the first wave was really just measure brand sentiment and brand lift and sales lift across 5 different segments. And the results of that first snapshot are here. On the left is a chart that depicts the brand lift across the different segments. And then on the right is the sales lift for those segments. And what's interesting about the segments is a good number of these were derived from the actual brand survey and the matching of that against their CRM data. So they weren't segments that were just coming out of their CRM system. So for things like the favorables was a segment. So those are frequent Walmart shoppers that have a favorable opinion and where brand favorability is pretty strong. Persuadable shoppers were those that shopped a lot in the category, but where Walmart had a low share of wallet and also low brand sentiment or low levels of favorability. So what we learned was that when we looked at the different segments they were going after, the most receptive segment was clearly those persuadable shoppers, which was really good news just because they do spend a lot in the category. So it wasn't necessarily a question of getting them to spend more. It was really just getting them to prefer Walmart over competitive retailers. So that was the first piece of insight. So what we decided to do for the next flight was to really just zero in on that one segment. So when we looked at ratings reports for that particular segment, or index rankers, or what we call them, where basically we look at the top rated networks among that segment, we found some really interesting things. The most important thing was that for the national campaign that was currently on air, only 2 of the top ranking networks were on the schedule. So there was clearly an opportunity just to be able to use this insight to optimize their linear schedule. And the other part of this that was really interesting, they were networks that weren't necessarily that obvious, some of which weren't even measured. So there's several networks in here that are long tail networks that aren't even measured by Nielsen. So, and that's one of the challenges with the currency as it is today. There's a lot of black holes, and in this particular case, it was a big black hole because even if Walmart were to look at that particular segment through the lens of a Nielsen, there was going to be a lot of networks that weren't necessarily rising to the top. And what was interesting here is a good number of those networks and day parts that rose to the top were things A, that they weren't running, and B, weren't even measured. So that was the area of opportunity for us to optimize the schedule. So then the next step was to really kind of prove out our thesis that if we optimized reach among persuadable shoppers that had low levels of favorability, but they spent a lot in the category, would we drive both brand and sales? And the answer was definitely yes. So what you see here is basically the same chart as I showed before. However, in this particular case, because persuadable shoppers was the segment they were really keenly interested in measuring, we compared the lift in brand and sales of the persuadable shopper against the general population. So on average, how did this campaign affect that particular segment? And the results were really baffling in terms of the magnitude of lift. You know, here, if you have a hard time seeing the axis, it basically translates to 2 to 3 times lift on brand among those households that were exposed to the spot. And then in terms of sales, there was a significant impact and lift on sales. But what was interesting here is as we looked at the individual creatives that were used, and that's how these charts are organized, is that each set of bars is a different piece of creative. What we found was that that second piece of creative that had the most impact on brand had a null effect on sales, which, by the way, wasn't overly surprising because it was really a spot that was aimed more at advanced educational programs that are available to the store associates. So it wasn't really even shot in store. It was designed primarily to drive brand. So they were extremely satisfied with the fact that they were able to drive brand in that particular domain. But what it gave them was the opportunity to identify if they wanted to really optimize both brand and sales, the other two pieces of copy were much more effective. So the next wave of optimization was really designed to optimize on a creative. They had their schedule set. They knew what inventory was most effective in reaching that particular audience. And now that the studies that we're doing are really rotating in different pieces of creative to see how different creative treatments against the same message impact both brand and sales lift. And more importantly than anything else, I think it demonstrates the power of television, and that if we don't, as an industry, concentrate on those upper funnel metrics, we're really missing a good portion of the value of television. And in cases where we've measured brand lift for cross-screen campaigns, there's no question that television drives much more favorable results when it comes to brand lift than digital can. And I know that's somewhat obvious. We've been talking about that for a while, but I really think it's important for us to have empirical evidence underneath that to support it, especially as we move forward and do more cross-screen. So in addition to doing the kind of reporting on an interval basis, we also created a reporting dashboard that provides insight into the core KPIs of the campaign. So yes, we are tracking impressions and impression delivery against the targets. We're also looking at which networks and day parts are over-indexing or over-delivering relative to others, because viewing is dynamic. And being able to get a look at this each day the data's refreshed. However, the period of time in which they optimize is generally a bi-weekly or monthly time frame. So what the dashboard is used for is really just getting pacing reports on that basis. And then as attribution metrics come in, as we match ad exposure data to sales metrics, they also are able to see not only how the campaign's converting, but they can drill down into SKUs or different product categories and different audience segments. So, and I think this addresses the other problem, which is, while it's wonderful that there's a migration to alternative, more advanced census-based data for measuring, generally, it takes a long time to analyze the data. And I would say that the average turnaround time for an attribution report in the States is literally months. So what we've tried to do is compress it down to weeks and then do it on a recurring basis so that the client can get not just that, hockey stick chart at the back end of the campaign, but during the flight, they can actually get insight in order to optimize the schedule, or the campaign, whether it has to do with creative or whether it has to do with the schedule itself. So it is early days. We're really excited just because we think this transition to kind of more advanced data and measurement is kind of a global trend. It's very clear based on all the developments and collaboration that is happening in Europe and Latin America, that the trend that we've seen in the States over the last couple of years is something that is definitely in motion as well over here. And we're really excited about that because we do think, more than anything else, better measurement will demonstrate the value of that TV investment. And I think this notion of taking money from TV and moving it into digital, clients are going to be a lot more reluctant to do that once they understand how impactful television is. So that's great news for television, regardless of how it's consumed. So I appreciate the time. I'm happy to take a couple of questions if we do in fact have time.
Ben, stand over here. We can put up the lights. Does anyone here would like to ask Ben a question? What is here? Please raise your hands. It's really hard to see. No, but I've got a couple of questions. I've seen this for the past 6 months. Are a lot of clients asking for this stuff from you? Is it flying off the shelf for you?
Well, it's a unique client that's willing to invest in this. I mean, clearly it's a client that really values the upper funnel metrics. So I would say there's tremendous demand for attribution because a lot of it is bought through the agencies. I think there's, what we're finding right now is a lot of demand for POCs to stand up kind of a single execution. With Walmart, that's work that has been happening over the last 18 months. So what we generally do with the agencies or with a smaller client is set up a POC, set up a test campaign, and then after that, it converts into this kind of ongoing measurement solution. And then the other component of this is some clients are really just interested in understanding the correlation of TV ad exposure to either site visitation or store visitation. And those are also verticals where first-party CRM data isn't necessarily available, so they'll use traffic as a proxy for performance. I call that kind of attribution light because it doesn't really go all the way to sales. But I would say that's really where the bulk of the demand is, just because those projects can be turned very quickly.
Now, you said you're in the early days. Like, what's really holding this back for becoming? I don't know, it looks like a lot of work as well per campaign, but what's really holding it back becoming a little bit more mainstream?
I think just education. I think, it's easy to get into this debate about, census-based data and to what extent it's going to topple the currency. And, by the way, I've probably been the most critical of Nielsen and the fact that we're using a focus group to measure $70 billion worth of investment. But that being aside, the currency is the currency. And regardless of the basis by which spots are bought and sold, doesn't mean you shouldn't be using data to understand which spots to buy and how to place those spots based on different creative messages. So said a different way, I think these alternative data sets are really effective for measuring and optimizing campaigns. And we don't even need to touch the currency, at least now. Now, granted, it would be much better and more effective, I think, if we could. But I do think that's something that's going to develop over time as this data set becomes truly national. So we're not focused on debating that. I think really the education is just around the different use cases for these alternative data sets. Aside from just getting better, more accurate measurement, what are some of the additional things that you can measure that are separate aside from GRPs and impressions?
Well, good segue there. Let's give Ben here a warm and hearty round of applause.
Thank you.